I mean, that has its strengths and its weaknesses, but it's certainly not like nationalism to get rid of the Indian Act. We're kind of accepting the Indian Act now in Kahnawake.
Mm. Why do you say that?
Because we're building our capacity, and we're doing a lot of good, strong things. I'm talking in the political realm, but we're not challenging the Indian Act at all.
How can Kahnawake challenge the Indian Act?
I think it's going to take another round of cultural and political conflict with the outside and inside, in terms of convincing people that the Indian Act itself is the thing that causes divisions, that prevents us from developing as a nation. But it has to be the priority of people, you know. So it's one thing for me, like as a political scientist, to say, oh yeah, in order to decolonize, we need to get rid of the Indian Act. But in reality, if it's not bothering people, if they don't see it as a priority, if people have managed to go around the Indian Act, and I think that's the real answer here in Kahnawake, is that there's not a big push for getting rid of the Indian Act because people have found ways around it. There's a whole industry here that supports a lot of people and generates a lot of money. The Band Council itself has found ways to go around it, and it doesn't impact people the same way it does in other parts of the country. Like if you go to some isolated areas in northern Manitoba or in northern BC, the only thing they got is the Indian Act, and the only thing they got is money that comes to there. So they're real subject to manipulation. So it's still like old Indian agent situation. So you guys behave, you ask permission if you do what we don't want you to do, and if you don't behave, we're gonna hold your money back, and you won't get to go to school. You won't even have a house.
Yeah. I know earlier you said that this Crown First Nations gathering is really just a photo op, but what good has come from it or can come from it?
I don't think there's anything good that has come from that. It was kind of a non-event. But that's not to say that meeting with governments is always useless. But I think what political leaders in Canada, Native political leaders, don't understand, except some of us here do, but on the whole, is that when you go to a negotiation, it reflects like the power balance. So if Canada has all the cards and all the money and all the power, and you're sitting down to negotiate, it doesn't matter what kind of ceremony you have. They hold all the power, and you're just there basically doing whatever they're willing to do. But if you come at it, if you kind of present a threat to them politically or economically, and you work to do that, sure, it causes trouble. But then when there's a negotiation, you hold a little more power, and they're going to be willing to give you a little more. It always comes to negotiation, right? Even Al-Qaeda and the United States are negotiating right now. So as much as the United States says, Osama bin Laden, the devil and all that stuff, hey, when a war is over, it always comes to negotiating. They're negotiating in Afghanistan with the Al-Qaedas. So, that's the fact. And so we think, politically speaking, as like natives across Canada, that the government is going to feel some responsibility to make life better. But they don't, because they don't really feel the need, because we're not making them feel the heat.
Okay, so in your opinion, more heat,
Yes.
more pressure tactics, and maybe we'll get there. You were saying, I don't know, earlier I got the impression that you were saying maybe another Oka crisis would sort of be the push to make people realize that their culture, their rights are important and something worth fighting for.
I think that's the lesson of history. Like all of us here lived through that, and I don't know how many people would want to again, but when you look at it, that's what gets governments moving. So whether it was the stand that was taken in 1990, or our brothers and sisters in Mi'kmaq, brothers and sisters with their lobster war, or the kind of things in Six Nations in Caledonia, or you could point to all of these situations where natives actually stood up. They get a response. If you just sit back and sit down and try to convince the government that they're wrong, it's not going to happen. They only respond to trouble.
Yeah. Is there a more positive way to approach it besides causing trouble?
Well, there's the long-term view. Okay, and they actually work together. The long-term view is that you sensitize Canadians and you educate Canadians as to the problem that they're facing in society. And so you convince younger generations of Canadian people that they are the cause of all the suffering that they complain about, that it's not the Indians who are the problem, that it's the whites that are the problem. And so the generation kind of over the years, I think, realizes that there's something wrong with Canada and we ought to fix it. But in the meantime, all these crises happen. And that's what really pushes people to an understanding. If there's no crisis, people are pretty comfortable.
Yeah.
And so it's our responsibility, really. Revolutionary movements all over the world whether they're cultural revolutions or political or physical, they have to be the ones that take the initiative to force the comfortable one to wake up. Otherwise, they're just going to sit there and watch TV all day and
Yeah.
drink their coffee and whatever. They're not going to know that anything's wrong with natives.
So let's look at an ideal world. Let's look at a world where there is no Indian Act.
I don't even know if that would be ideal. I think that would be the start. Like, the Indian Act came in 1851 in its first form because the Canadian government at that time could take advantage of our weakness, you know, because of diseases and all these kind of things that happened to us. We weren't able to stand up to the government. And they said, okay, now we're going to come in and we're going to manage you. You're not a nation anymore. You're an Indian under our control. So we kind of moved back, you know, to a point where say the government was forced by political action all over the country to back off and say, all right, now we need a more respectful relationship. But that would just be the start, because then the reality is now this country's here. All these people are here. They're not going to pack up and go back to wherever their ancestors were from. That's a pipe dream. So what becomes of the Indian Affairs Department? Maybe it becomes a Department of Indigenous Relations. I think the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in '96 recommended that Indian Affairs be changed to the Department of Relations with Indigenous Nations or something like that. So it would be a long process, I think, of just reshaping the relationship where natives have what we've always wanted. Which, if you go, I think to one of the longhouses. I don't know if it's an Onondaga or Six Nations. I think it's Six Nations. It's an Onondaga longhouse. And you see Descahe, the Iroquois leader from the 20s who went all over the world promoting our ideas. And it's a very simple thing that he has there that he used to say, we want the right to live by our culture, to have our spiritual power on our own land. And that's it, basically. It's how can the government recognize natives having control of their own land and making their own decisions and benefiting from their own territories. So it's real simple. Right now, we have no right to do that in law. And the fight is really to get them to respect our right to live our own kind of life and make decisions on our own territory.
Is that possible?
It is, if we stand up and do it. And I think that you need allies, though. So we need people in the larger society to understand this problem and to be committed to working with us to do it, because we are not going to force 32 million.
Yeah. Is it ever possible to get what they call Indian country? You know what I mean? Like our own land that we officially own, that we govern, our laws, our ways, our culture. Is that possible?
Well, the last person who tried to make that happen in reality was Tecumseh in early part of the 1800s. And he failed to have a separate country carved out of America and Canada. So if they were that strong back then, culturally and militarily and all that stuff, and couldn't do it, I don't know now about that. So that's why I don't follow too much that vision of Indian country, although it's a fantasy. It's a dream.
It's an alluring one.
It is. I mean, I think in the long term, I'd love to see that. Every native would. Our own country being like our traditional country, we want it back. But in the meantime, I'm not going to sit around and do nothing or collaborate with the government to just do what they want us to do. I'm going to try to find a way to reattach to the land and have my kids reattach to their traditional homeland so that they understand what it is to be Ongwehue. Even though we don't have all of our 9 million acres back, you know.
So in a way, there always will be a quote-unquote Indian Act. We always will have to deal with the Canadian government, but hopefully more respect can be built, and hopefully our rights can be acknowledged, and we can live as Indigenous people rightfully. I
think that, yeah, I agree. And what they need to do is take that Indian Act, abrogate it in Parliament, and say it no longer exists. In the same second, have a act of Parliament that says this is the Indigenous Nations Relations Act, which then recognizes the relationship based on treaties that we've had. As simple as that, right? And then the hard work comes in working out all the financial and administrative, but the foundation is the Indian Act versus the treaties.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you to Yayage for being here, and for Dreamcatchers, I'm Lauren McCumber.